Welcome everybody, good evening and welcome to Friends of the Lake District's webinar, Who Pays for the Lake District, which we hope will be the start of a discussion around the need for a visitor levy. We will be recording the webinar so that people who are unable to make it this evening can watch at a time convenient for them via our website. Comments are currently turned off, but you can ask questions via the Zoom question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions after our main presentation, so please feel free to add your questions as we go along. I'm Kate Wilshaw, a Policy Officer at Friends of the Lake District, and with me this evening is Mike Hall, our Chief Exec, and Dr Davina Stanford, a Sustainable Tourism Specialist who undertook the research for the report. First, we'd like to run a quick poll. I'll give you a minute or so to answer the question, which should appear on your screen at some point soon. It does take a while to come up once it's been launched. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, if you can answer that question, that would be brilliant. Excellent. I'm hoping that, yes, there you go, there's the results come up. So looks like we've got quite a large majority in favour of actually putting in place a visitor levy or a visitor tax. Few people strongly disagree or disagree. That's fair enough. And we're actually going to be repeating this poll at the end of the session just to see if people's views have changed on it. So a quick introduction. Over the past 15 to 20 years, the impact of tourism on the Lake District has become progressively more obvious to those of us who live here, work here and care about the landscape, communities, wildlife and heritage of the national park. These impacts manifest in the Lake District as traffic jams, sewage in our lakes and rivers, lack of affordable housing for local people, fragmentation of communities and damage to habitats. This is the invisible burden of tourism, the failure to adequately account for and manage tourism's burdens, which puts the long-term social, environmental and economic health of popular tourist destinations in peril. Friends of the Lake District commissioned Davina to undertake this piece of research to identify and bring to the surface the invisible burdens that the Lake District is suffering from, and more importantly, to look at how other places deal with the invisible burdens that they are faced with through a visitor levy or a tourist tax. We also asked Davina to look at whether tourist taxes have a negative impact on the number of visitors. Over-tourism in the Lake District has been a fact of life for years. Residents and people who work here know it's an issue, but it sometimes feels like a bit of a taboo subject. This is one of the reasons why we want to start a conversation about whether and how there can be a better balance between the needs and rights of local communities, those visiting the Lake District, and not forgetting the safeguarding of the landscape itself that we all love. The evidence from Davina's work shows that putting in place a tourist tax hasn't deterred visitors in other destinations, and in places that raise money from visitor levies, funding is available to deal with the impacts of tourism to make these places so much better. Who wouldn't want reduced price or free bus services in the Lake District, a network of safe cycling, walking and wheeling routes throughout the national park, reduced traffic, more social housing and clean water in our lakes? All of these need resources and in some cases new laws to solve, but other places in Europe and further afield have addressed these problems without destroying their tourist industry. So now I'm going to pass you on to Davina, who will present her research. This should last about 20 minutes with a short follow-up from Mike. We'll then be having half an hour or so of questions afterwards and then some final thoughts. Again, if you have a question, please can you type it into the question and answer box, and we will be picking questions to ask Davina and Mike. We may not get round to answering all of them. If your question hasn't been answered, please send us an email to info@fld.org.uk and we'll do our best to reply over the next week or so. Now, Davina, your presentation.
Thank you, Kate. So what I'm going to do is summarise over the next 20 minutes or so the report that came out of the research that I did, which looked at these externalities of tourism and then looked at some of the sort of solutions, the sort of fundraising mechanisms that other destinations have put in. So there are a lot of visitors to the lakes, and this can put pressure on a somewhat small population. The ratio is sort of, is quite skewed in terms of the number of visitors and the number of residents in population. There are just 39,000 residents. And much of the funding for essential services and infrastructure is based on resident numbers, and there can be a shortfall. I think there is also a sense sometimes that the residents can feel overwhelmed, and what we want to avoid really is that feeling of having nowhere else to go other than rage, and hence the picture that I've put up here about the response to second home ownership. And I'll come back to second home ownership just a little bit later, and we can look in detail at what that means for local residents. So next slide, please. So just a bit of background to the way that the report is structured. It withdrew on a report that someone else had written. They coined the phrase "the invisible burden." This was a report written by another academic, and on behalf of the Travel Foundation. And in that report, they identify 6 sort of externalities, 6 areas where tourism holds an invisible burden, where there's a cost. And they look at cost in terms of environmental, social, as well as economic. And the different categories that they identify are energy and greenhouse gas emissions, water, solid waste, sewage, natural capital, and social capital. And to that, we added a 7th category, looking in particular at transport, because it is so much of an issue for the Lake District. So I'm just going to talk through each of those very briefly. If you can go on to the next slide, please. So the first one I looked at then is the greenhouse gas emissions in Cumbria, drawing on data from Small World Consulting from 2023. Again, there's a lot of detail on this slide, but I just want to draw your attention to the right-hand side of the slide, where we see that the majority of CO2 emissions actually comes from visitors travelling to and from the area. And in particular, it comes from vehicle fuel. And that's really sort of important to consider. And it really sort of dwarfs the other greenhouse gas emissions from residents and other visitor activities. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what does all of that mean then? What's the impact of those greenhouse gas emissions? Of course, climate change, and there's a cost associated with that. So I've got some illustrations here of the storms that we think are due in part to a changed climate. Storm Desmond was estimated to have cost 500 million across Cumbria. The storms of 2022 to 2023, including Storm Arwen. Just for one business, Skelworth Fold, I found a figure here that they estimated that it's cost them 500,000 in expenses to extract trees which had fallen as a result of storms. And other impacts of climate change include species lost, upward migration of habitat, an increase in non-native invasive species, increases in algal bloom, damage to woodland, drying out of peat, risk of extreme weather events. We're just waiting to see what Johan brings us, and footpath erosion. So the next slide, water use. Not much to say about water. It's not so much of an issue in the Lake District. There's just 3 points I want to make. The first is that it's not so much of an issue, but secondly, that in dry periods, such as the summer of 2023, there was a point at which the reservoir water levels dropped to levels of concern. And a final point here, just if you have a look at the information on the slide there, is that tourists typically use more water per day than residents do. Next slide, please. So the next category is solid waste, and the research that I looked at here was from a report from Friends of the Lake District with Keep Britain Tidy. The interesting thing I found from that report is that 27% of visitors admitted to littering, which I found an astounding figure. And also, when people are admitting to that, it means that there will be people who do not admit to that. And then there's a breakdown here of the kinds of littering behaviour, with the most common is leaving an item next to, on top of an overflowing bin, and I'm sure we will all have seen that. So next slide, please, which is about sewage in the Lake District. So I think one of the best ways to understand this is sort of by example, really, and to look at one area in particular. So the area I want to highlight is the Windermere catchment area. So in the Windermere catchment area, in 2022, there were 7 million visitors, and the sewage system is designed for residents, basically. So it's designed for a number that's far lower than that, and it's unable to cope with those sorts of numbers. So we were seeing 246 full days of sewage discharge from storm overflows into Windermere. And that has a cost. I mean, it has an environmental cost. It can contribute to algal blooms. The illustration here is from the Great North Swim, which was cancelled in 2010, with an estimated economic cost of 1.5 million. And these algal blooms are still occurring. They were reported last summer in 2023 as well, with recommendations to stay out of the water. I think it is fair to say that United Utilities are investing in that with an attempt to reduce the stormwater overspills. Nevertheless, it's still a cause for concern. Looking at natural capital and sort of the impact of tourists on the landscape, we can see here the impact of 10 million visitors, next to 10 million walkers on the national park's paths. It's causing erosion. So the photograph on the left-hand side is erosion on Scarfell Pike. The photograph on the right-hand side is the restored path from interventions from Fix the Fells. And they require 500,000 per annum to maintain the cover level of work, or £150 per metre. Okay, so the next slide, please. This was a piece of research which I found really interesting, and it's about it's the social capital. It's the issue of housing, and I think the most dominant sort of social capital issue is the issue of second home ownership, holiday let, Airbnb, and an increase in commuter and retirement homes. So what you're looking at here in this slide, if you look again at the right-hand side, the parishes highlighted in red are those which have more than 20% of their properties not used for permanent residency. And that's significant because it's considered that anything above 20% can increase or impact on house prices. They'll increase. It causes a decline in resident population, which threatens the viability of GPs, dentists, schools, and so on. There's a loss of a sense of community, and there can be labour shortages because housing is unaffordable. Next slide, please. And then finally, transport. So with this, we've got this is actually the approach to Buttermere on a sunny spring day. As we've seen, particularly private petrol vehicles contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, noise congestion, wildlife disturbance, fly parking. And this fly parking can have an impact on emergency services, which should be hindered by cars parked on verges. And in some cases, they block bus routes. So the bus routes can't get through due to parked cars. Okay, so that sort of rounds up really quickly some of the most significant issues that became of externalities or costs of tourism to the Lake District, Cumbria. But what about the solutions then? So then I looked at the different types of taxes, and there are a number of ways of raising income to sort of offset some of these impacts. These can be around voluntary levies, such as visitor giving, levies requiring primary legislation from government, such as taxes, or tools and sort of instruments such as business improvement districts, which again is a sort of like a sort of tax, but more localized. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you next slide, please? So I just briefly, there's more detail on this in the report, but I wanted to look at attitudes towards taxes because I know it's a sensitive issue. And at the time of writing, Edinburgh were considering a tourist tax. They've done some research into attitudes, and they found that residents and businesses overall were in support of a tourist tax. Wales were also doing a similar piece of research, and they found that consumers and residents, again, overall were in support of some sort of visitor tax if they could see where the benefits went. In a separate piece of research, I looked at the attitudes of DMOs, that's destination management organisations. Again, overall, they're in support. Although I think, in fairness, to balance that, again, at the time of writing, at the time of researching, we were seeing some kickbacks against bids from businesses who found the schemes difficult, and there were perhaps questions whether or not they were value for money for their investment. Okay, so the next section then was to look at some case studies, to look at examples elsewhere of what other destinations were doing, including this example here from the Balearic Islands, the tourist tax there, which was introduced in 2016 and has, the cost of the tax is quite low. It's sort of, a few euros per person per night. It's raised 263 million since 2016, and the balance of where that money's gone can be seen on the right-hand side of the infographic there, with the majority of the funds invested in the environment. Next slide, please. So again, in the report, I know it's a sensitive issue, so we wanted to look at the impact of having that tax. So the slide that you're seeing here is a number of tourist arrivals. So if you look at 2016, when the tax was introduced, visitor numbers increased. They didn't increase, it didn't put people off. The decrease was due to COVID, and then post-COVID numbers recovered. Next slide, please. And in terms of expenditure, again, if you look at the middle of the slide at 2016, there was an increase after the introduction of the tourist tax in terms of expenditure of international visitors. There was a drop-off during the COVID pandemic, and again, a recovery and an increase post-COVID and in 2022. So it hasn't affected visitor spend as far as we could see either. Okay, so the next example is from Ile de Ré, which is an island just off La Rochelle in France. In 2012, they introduced an environmental tax to cross the bridge from the mainland to the island of of Ile de Ré, which is a key tourist hotspot. I think it's called Paris by the Sea. It attracts a lot of Parisians during the summer months. So there's a sort of a layered charging mechanism. The details are in the report. The key thing to note is that the charge generates 13.8 million euros a year. So if we go to the next slide, we can see what that money is spent on. So, I mean, I think this is really of interest. So the fund is used for the provision of free electric bus shuttles, circuits on demand, and transport services around the entire island, with nearly 200,000 trips per year. And then 2 million euros have been used to maintain wetland and woods, and to restore dune systems, and to pay for 12 eco guards. And they've also used the fund to help protect sort of livelihoods and to sort of discourage land grabs for sort of tourism purposes. Next slide, please. This is the case study from Venice. I mean, this has been featured quite highly in the news. The Venice day visitor ticketing, and this is in addition to an overnight tax. So there was already an overnight tax in Venice when this was introduced. It was sort of introduced as a pilot, charging up to 10 euros for sort of day entrance to the city. The intention was that it would be used for a tech system, a smart management system, which would help monitor visitor flows around Venice and help identify where the pressure points were. In the 2.5-month pilot, 450,000 tourists raised 2.2 million euros, and visitor numbers were not reduced. So there was no impact, visible impact on visitors, no reduction of visitors. Next slide, please. This is the next case study is from a business improvement district. This is actually from London and Bankside Business Improvement District, or BID. It's one of the first ones to be established in the UK in 2005. And unlike some bids which look to use the funds for sort of commercial purposes of running events and marketing and so on, the purpose of this bid was, I mean, there was some economic elements, but also there was a sense that it should be used for environmental and social actions to drive positive change in the neighbourhood. I picked this because of that example, but also because even though it's not a tourism bid, it's a very touristic area with services such as Shakespeare's Globe, the Tate Modern and Borough Market there. And if you look at the infographic there, you can see how they've spent their bid, the percentages, the breakdown of where the money from the bid has been spent, with the majority of it spent on environmental innovation. And if we have a look at the next infographic, I've just highlighted a few examples here of the specific projects that they've invested in. So things like funding sustainable drainage, things like tree planting, things like street greening. So that's the picture here that we're seeing with the street greening, saving so many tons of CO2 through recycling projects and so on. So, you know, has been put to a lot of environmental good to enhance the environment of Bankside. And then on to, I think it was the final case study. So this case study was from the Milan Eco Pass. This was introduced in 2008, intended to discourage polluting vehicles to enter into the city of Milan. And so the most polluting vehicles were charged the highest fee. The money that it raised was used to fund public transport, to fund car sharing schemes, and to encourage and support cycle mobility. And running that scheme saw a reduction in traffic of 16.2%, road accidents reduced by 21.3%, and the highest polluting vehicles declined by 48.1%. I mean, in some respects, it's interesting because it was actually a sort of a victim of its own success. It was so successful in discouraging high polluting vehicles that the revenue that was being raised for those different schemes dropped off. So then they changed the Eco Pass from a sort of pollution tax to a congestion charge. And the research that's been done sort of looking into that sort of suggests that actually the introduction of the Eco Pass and the focus on pollution paved the way for the congestion charge, which no one really challenged, and that has also been very successful. And the illustration here is just sort of demonstrates some of the infrastructure that's required on the approach into Milan. And that concludes the real whistle-stop tour of the report. There'll be more detail in there if you want to follow up.
Thank you very much for that, Davina. Absolutely fascinating canter through your research. If that is the first time that you have seen that research, then I urge you to read the full version. You can download it from our website. Now, Davina is an independent academic researcher that we commissioned to undertake this research for us. So I just wanted to say a few words about the topic from a Friends of the Lake District perspective. In summary then, there are many, many benefits to tourism, as Davina said. We've also got to acknowledge that tourism brings challenges, those invisible burdens, as she said. Now, Davina's shown us some examples of other tourist destinations around the world where visits have a positive and a negative impact, and some interesting examples of ways in which a visit can be turned into a regenerative relationship, something that puts value back into the area via a levy. Next slide, please. This question is often asked: could a levy affect the tourism trade? Davina looked into that several times throughout her presentation. It's an understandable question. Tourism is a vital industry here in the Lake District. We need to ensure it stays healthy. Now, as Davina said, there are dozens of places around the world where a levy has been introduced. There are indeed several places in the UK where a levy is under consideration or is on the way in, actively being introduced. Wales is one such place, and in 2024 the Welsh Government asked Bangor University to look into the likely impact of a visitor levy in Wales. And from all the research we've seen, there's little or no evidence that levies damage revenues in any way. Remember this chart? I thought it was worth repeating. Davina showed us the Balearic Islands, their revenue from tourism. They brought in a visitor levy in 2016, and so that's all the columns in red to the right of that moment, 2016. There was obviously a dip for the lockdowns around COVID, but there's no evidence of any drop-off in visitor revenue after 2016 when that visitor levy was brought in. Next slide, please. So it's our view at Friends that a well-designed visitor levy system delivering significant funds which are spent on the right things would actually improve the visitor experience and possibly even boost the tourism industry. And I just want to talk through a quick example. There are several different ways that you could bring in a visitor levy, and Davina talked about some of those. This is an example that we think it's worth exploring. We think there are ways in which the Transport Act, which was brought in the year 2000, could enable local authorities to charge visitor vehicles as they enter the park. We have about 18 million visitors a year. 90% of them come in a car. So this would be an almost universal charge. The charge could be set at a very low level, £2, £3. Residents of Cumbria could be made exempt, and people travelling within the park on business could also be made exempt. Now, under the Transport Act, funds raised must be spent on improving transport and mobility. So this is what happened in London when the congestion charge came in. The funds from the congestion charge had to be spent on improving the tube trains, improving the buses, putting in new cycle routes. How folk get around. So here are 4 quick examples of the benefits that this could bring. And I must say at this moment, we've got a lot to learn from Ullswater. In the Ullswater catchment, there's some great work going on by some great people to join up the transport services in that valley. And the people leading that charge there talk about joining up the 4 B's: bus, bike, boot, and boat. So in this model, the revenue would come in from the thousands of cars arriving here. The idea then is to get people to leave their cars at their accommodation and travel sustainably during their stay. So we probably can't make much of a difference to how they come to the park. They're probably going to continue to drive. But if we can get them to then leave their cars during their stay, travel around by bus like the Ullswater Hopper here in the picture here, or bike, or walking, or by boat, then it's a win for everyone. So could we use some of that money to invest in a bus service for every valley, not just Ullswater? Could we invest some of that money in new, safe, segregated bike routes across the Lake District? Maybe with electric bike hubs, so you can hire electric bikes to flatten those mountains out. Maybe we could pay for dozens more rangers to work with the brilliant people at Fix the Fells on mending all the footpaths. These are eroded every year by the millions of visitors who come here. Maybe we could use some of that money to subsidise boat services so they can run more frequently and possibly switch their engines for less polluting models. Suddenly, those visitor vehicles have a regenerative relationship with the park they're visiting. The visitors see their couple of quid making a real difference to the landscape that they love. And that's just one example of how a visitor levy could work. There are others we need to consider too. But I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand back to Kate, who's going to explain now how we're going to conclude with some of your questions.
Right, thanks, Mike, and thanks very much, Davina, as well. We've basically been getting questions in our question and answers. Some of them have actually already been answered. So we had a question from Steve Lenartowitz and also from, sorry, I can't find it. But yeah, we had two questions which were like, why haven't you talked about a car tax or a vehicle tax? And obviously Mike's just given a really good example there of car taxes and vehicle taxes. So what the first question I've had from two people, from Andy G and from Gemma Proctor, and it's, how do you define a visitor?
I think I'm going to ask Davina to take that one.
I mean, yes, I mean, I know that there are a lot of the visitors come from within Cumbria. I think certainly, you could look at the UNWTO definition, which is someone who sort of comes from a place outside their normal residence. I mean, this is a definition of a tourist. They come from outside their normal residence. They would stay overnight. They would stay for less than a year, but that sort of relates to overnight visitors. I mean, I would say then that visitors are, or is it tourists, are those whose primary purpose is for leisure and recreation. And, that would be how I would view them. And I think that, that might relate to day visitors. And I think those are perhaps some of the more sort of problematic, visitors. They're harder to quantify, harder to track, perhaps don't bring as many benefits in terms of overnight stays and so on. But yeah, anything you want to add, Mike?
No, I accept to repeat what I said during that little section there, that in designing a visitor levy, you could actually exclude residents of Cumbria, so a wider area than just the Lake District. You could also exclude people travelling around the Lake District on business if you wanted. It would be up to us, I think, to work out what the rules are.
I think an addition from Gemma here is that locals account for nearly 20% of day trippers, so making them exempt will limit the impacts of a congestion charge. Although saying that 20%, you've still got 80% coming in, so there's still going to be some. But I just thought that was an interesting comment on who is a visitor, and we've actually had quite a lot of questions on that, including how would a tourist tax or car charge affect people who live outside of the Lake District but work here or visit here. So there's a lot of concern about this coming up, which is quite interesting.
Can I speak to that, Kate? Is that
Yeah.
right? I mean, I think some of the examples, there are quite sophisticated mechanisms for charging. The Eel-to-Ray example, for example, residents aren't charged. If you travel with an EV vehicle, it's a lesser charge or perhaps no charge. There are very many ways of structuring that charge, which would sort of eliminate those. Other charges, perhaps, and this isn't relating to transport. For the bid, for example, charities get a discount. So there are, different ways of ensuring that it's fair. And I think there needs to be an issue there of fairness.
Yeah. Okay, so here's an interesting one. The National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act 1949 says that national parks or protected landscapes are to be protected for the nation. Should funding reflect this with realistic funding from central government? How does the current funding situation actually reflect this duty?
Yeah, well, in an ideal world, of course, yes. But the truth is that in real terms, funding for the National Park Authority has been steadily declining for the last decade or so. It's hard to see, given the current economic realities facing this country, it's hard to see how that's going to go up anytime soon. So, in my view, those of us who love this place and participate in working out how to safeguard this place need to look for more creative ways of raising revenue to help this place survive and thrive. I'm not sure that we can just say there needs to be more money from central government if other services funded by central government are also under huge pressure at a time like this.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think there's been some comment about the fact that we pay more VAT than any other country in Europe. So, why should we be then paying a tourist tax? But it's like that VAT goes to central government and it's not given back to the areas that are raising it. So I think that fits very well with that. We're not getting the resources that are required.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. It's about the vehicle tax. It's from Ken Taylor. I put the idea of a road tax to the National Park Sustainable Transport Officer, and she's adamant that a new law would be required. Is she right, or which piece of law says she's wrong?
I don't know is the honest answer. We wrote this report in order to start a conversation, and part of that is obviously, consulting widely in using events like tonight to hear from people about whether some sort of visitor levy would be welcomed or not. Another big part of that conversation is about whether it's even possible, and is there the technology in place to allow for some of these models to work? Is the legislation in place to allow some of these models to work? Let alone the agreement among all the organizations that partner together on this area. So the honest answer is we need to do some more research into that. Our initial assumptions are that the same law that allows London to levy the congestion charge could allow other authorities, local authorities around the UK, to levy some sort of visitor vehicle charge. But we've yet to test that.
Okay. Thank you. Next question is from Tony, and it says the research points towards the problem of second homes. Why are you not focusing on that?
Can I jump in here?
Yes,
I mean,
please do.
I do think it's a really crucial issue. You're right to flag it up. I mean, I think problematically, that is not going to be addressed by visitor levies. That's going to be addressed by other policy measures, which perhaps protect and secure housing, that local housing is for local residents. So I'm not sure the extent to which, I mean, I know we've included it there as an externality. I think it was important to capture it as an issue, but I don't know the extent to which a visitor tax could address that. Having said that, I mean, there is some examples from the Balearics about some of that money being reinvested in social housing, but I think there's a long way to go, and there would be a big gap between what could be raised and what's actually required.
Could you also add in a bit there, Davina, about the fact that we don't have the law in place to do this at the moment?
That's true. Yeah, that's true. I mean, a lot of this requires legislation. So, a lot of the things that we're talking about require primary legislation, which requires action from central government. These are not issues that can be tackled locally and sort of independently locally. Yeah.
Sorry, Mike, did you want to come in on that?
I was just going to mention a particularly creative way that they tackle that second home issue on the Ile de Ré in France. As Davina said in her research, you have to go over a bridge to get onto the island, so it gives them it gives the authorities a really simple toll mechanism, and that money goes to the mairie, to the local councils on the island, to more or less do to address the issues that they see are relevant in each area of the island. And one thing they do relevant to second homes is they use this pot of money to buy vacant properties when they come up, and they hold them in trust for as affordable housing for locals and workers on the island. So in other words, they are manipulating the housing stock. They're not just allowing it all to go to wealthy Parisians. They are actually socially engineering their towns to so that they'd never reach that magic percentage that Davina mentioned, where a town becomes unsustainable because there aren't enough permanent residents, and everyone goes home in the winter, and the shop has to close, and the school has to close.
Like you, that's really a really good illustration of what could be done with, like really innovative thinking. There's two questions here which sort of are related. So one is, would disabled visitors have to pay the visitor levy if they travel by car? And secondly, if it is a national park for all, should we be charging for access, or is that social exclusion?
Those are really good questions, and that
Definitely.
comes back to, you would want to, whatever you wanted, you would want it to be socially equitable. And again, this is just the very start of a conversation, but I hear those points loud and clear. Mobility for disabled people, and what was the other one?
Social exclusion if we're charging for access to the Lake District.
Absolutely, I hear that. I don't know how you get around that one, especially if it was a vehicle charge. Apart from to say that I actually think it would only be a quid or two, and that's how you do it. Is you peg it really low.
Yeah, I think also blue badge holders are exempt in London from the congestion charge, but not from the low emission zone. So that there are ways of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, if there's, I mean, I think all of this, I agree with everything you've said, Mike. I think there are, it starts a conversation. There's certainly, there would need to be a lot of consultation. But I think there are sort of innovative examples elsewhere that haven't been in the report. So things like, in Copenhagen, visitors can contribute to sort of litter picking in return for some rewards. So if people did feel that they were short of money, there can be a sort of quid pro quo that you don't pay the fee, but you'd sort of make some sort of contribution in another way. And that is actually a really good feel-good factor.
That's fascinating. That goes back to, I mentioned it a few times, the regenerative feeling that that tourism, that your visit is not an extractive visit. You're not just going and taking from the landscape. You're going and investing money back into the landscape, or effort or care or love in some way.
Okay, so loads of questions like that. We're getting a lot of engagement here. So what about free park and ride at main entry points with comprehensive subsidised buses to all popular destinations?
Yeah, it is a potential impact of putting a charge in place would be that you would need to work out what happens to all the people who decide to leave their cars just outside the area and come in different ways. And you could either just let that happen and see what happened, which would be slightly chaotic, or you could formalise that in some way with park and rides, which are a very common feature of many towns across the UK already. Davina, have you looked into that at all?
I was just sort of racking my brains for an example. I'm sure that would be a model that's been used in the US national parks to sort of exclude vehicles, but I mean their setup is very different. But I think in any of these things, it's good to have these conversations to look how it works in practice elsewhere, and that would be sort of part of the process really, to sort of see how it's been implemented elsewhere, how it might be transferred to the context here.
Kate, I know that you've done a lot of thinking about the Snowdonia model. Could you say that's a park and ride?
Yes, for those that don't know, Snowdonia basically made parking up on the passes around Snowdon extremely expensive. So I think it's £25 a day. And what they've done instead is said, well, you have to book a place in the very expensive car park, or you can leave your car at the bottom. And there are, I think it's either free or very, very subsidised minibuses up to the top of the passes. And they've also put really, really strict parking restrictions on the roads going up to the centre of Snowdonia, which has basically meant that the parking issues that they were having are pretty much they've been a lot better because people are getting their vehicles towed away for poor parking, and essentially it's meant that public transport can flow a hell of a lot more easier. Emergency vehicles can get through, mountain rescue can get through, and it's not solved the problem of all transport in Snowdonia, but as far as a honeypot area goes, it really has actually. It's a new model, it's a new way of doing things, and in general, there's been some really interesting comments from people, which is like, oh well, like you don't feel sorry for the people that had their cars towed because they shouldn't have parked there. They knew that this could happen, so why don't they do what everyone else is doing and get the minibus up to the top? Obviously, again, for disabled people, there are exemptions because you can't expect disabled people to be able to do that sort of thing. So it's a case of you can't make it one size fits all. You've got to take into account that people have different needs. But in general, the able-bodied people that are going up there to walk up Snowdon do not need to park their cars at the top. So yeah, it's been quite a good model. Okay, next question, and this is a very practical one. Who would collect the taxes or levy, and who would decide how they're distributed? Gets the nub of it, really, doesn't it?
It does. I think from my perspective, actually, who distributes the money is every bit as important, if not more so, as how the money is raised. And I guess to go back to the example of the Transport Act, in that case, it would be a local authority. So in London, it's the mayoral authority. Here, it would be the councils, Westmoreland and Furness and Cumberland Council. And as I said earlier, under the Transport Act, the funds from that are hypothecated, so they're ring fenced. They can only be spent on improving transport and mobility. Other models could see other agencies collecting that money. Davina, which other agencies could collect that money in a UK model?
I mean, I think typically, well, it depends on the tax, but I think typically it would go through the local authorities. I mean, certainly from a business improvement district, that would go through the local authorities. I was just looking back at my notes of what they'd done in Ile de Ré, because I think there was something in the report about how that had been administered. It goes through the municipalities, and then the stakeholders agree how it's spent. They gather each year to agree priorities and to just agree where that money is spent. And again, I think with the Balearics examples, that's the local authority. So they're actually sort of pretty key and instrumental in that.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a question from Nigel Thompson, who says, thank you for the presentation. What would you like to see happen now in the light of this report? And do you get a sense that Cumbria Tourism and others would take some convincing that a charge will not lead to a reduction in visitors?
In terms of what happens now, as I said earlier, we have commissioned this report simply to start a conversation. So from our perspective, we have that conversation. We listen. This event tonight, events we're going to be running over the coming weeks, conversations we're going to have across the Lake District National Park Partnership with other organisations. We may even decide to run a public poll, a YouGov poll, to ask people how they would feel about a couple of quid going to helping the infrastructure and services of the park. In terms of what would convince the tourism industry, I mean, the best incentive of all would be if we made the Lake District a more attractive destination. In my view, we could be the greenest, most regenerative tourist destination in the world if we really lean into this. And that could help people decide to want to come here. I guess the corollary of that is if we do nothing about the invisible burdens that we've looked at tonight, maybe numbers will start to decline because the visitor experience will start to degrade, and nobody wants that. So the best incentive would be brilliant new buses, brilliant new services, brilliant new cycle paths, and a sense that every visit here helps regenerate this beautiful place.
Thank you, Mike. And actually, I think on that note, it's probably about time to wrap up. And yeah, I think you finished it off very nicely there. There's a lot of questions that have already been answered or have overlaps with questions that we've already had. I've had a few people say that, say in South Africa, we had to pay to go into Cape National Park. Park and rides are common, for example, in some US national parks. Really good point. Please remember the disabled cannot hop on a bike and walking is often limited. Boats are often difficult and most buses only accommodate one wheelchair. So these are all really good things for us to think about. You know, like other places are managing to do this. It's not like we're stepping out on our own, even starting to consider this. So I think I just really want to say thank you very much to everybody who's put questions into the chat. I'm sorry if we've not actually got round to answering your question, but if you want to carry on the conversation, do get in touch with us. And, you know, like we have taken note of the questions and who's asked them if you've actually put your name on there. So we're very happy to carry on this conversation afterwards. So yes, I think that's probably it for the question and answer session. Thanks. And yes, we're now repeating the poll. So if people could actually fill the poll in when it turns up on your screen. There it is. Same question as previously, see if anything's changed. Thank you. There you go. We've got even more people strongly agreeing, but we actually have more people strongly disagreeing, which is interesting. So sounds like it's been slightly polarizing tonight, which, well, you know, we're starting a conversation. We haven't got all the answers. We're just actually saying these things could happen. It's happening elsewhere. We want to talk about it. So I think basically, yes, we're starting the conversation. So can you move on to the next slide, please? Right, so Mike did a really good summary about why we're doing this. So what's next is we're basically talking to people. So if you want to have a conversation with us about it, please get in touch. We're talking to a number of parish councils about this and some local groups as well. We've organised talks for them. Get in touch if you'd like me or Mike to come and talk to your group or your parish council, town council, whatever. You can get in touch by emailing info@friends of the Lake District, fld.org.uk. And lastly, if you think the work that we're doing is valuable, please do support us. You can become a member for £2.75 a month. We have a huge range of events coming up over the next year. I think we've got over 50 timetabled in from March onwards. So you can actually see some of the upcoming events below. And if you go to our webpage and click on the events tab, you'll be able to book onto any of those events that you're interested in. And I think with that, I'd just like to say thank you again to everybody. Thanks to Helen and Christian for helping behind the scenes. And I'll say good night. Thanks very much for coming along.